Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to risk management, business continuity, COVID, psychology, well-being, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I know many of you out there pay attention to right now, because we're all paying attention to it right now. And you all know that I love to read and read a lot. And today, I'd like to welcome to the show the author of The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It. I'd like to welcome Douglas W. Hubbard. Doug, actually, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Alex.
I know we tried to hook up before to have you come on the show, but calendars, we just couldn't coordinate schedules. So I'm really glad to have you here. Let me tell you, the title of the book, that's going to grab people's attention, The Failure of Risk Management. And I know a few risk managers who are going to be listening really intently to this show today.
Great. Well, I hope so. Actually, that was part of the plan with the title.
Now, I know we've gone back and forth a few times, and I've read the book. Can you take a minute or two and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into what you do?
Yeah, sure. I've always been in some form of quantitative management consulting for 35 years now. So back in the 80s, I joined what was then the Big Eight in accounting and consulting firms. I was in management consulting services with Coopers and Lybrand. Now they're PricewaterhouseCoopers. Those merged. So there were 8 at the time. It was called the Big Eight. Now there's fewer. But I was always involved in some form of quantitatively analyzing big uncertain decisions. The biggest difference between now and then, I think, was a lot of our analysis was Fortran and Lotus 1-2-3. Which, those, we don't use those anymore. But the basic ideas, the operations research, management science, game theory stuff, that was all the same. The partner who ran the management consulting services office there, he came from Rand Corporation, and he saw everything as ultimately a quantitative problem. And I looked at it that way too. Well, about 24 years ago, we started our own business, started doing this. I'd written my first book, How to Measure Anything, in 2007, actually. And that book, the first edition of it that you just held up, came out in 2009. And a lot of this came from the fact that I was skeptical about a lot of the methods I was seeing businesses and governments use. So I would see them use methods that were unlike what I learned in more quantitative settings, operations research, management science, statistical methods, and so forth. And I was wondering, why are those methods so popular? Because there's plenty of people using the methods that I criticize. So why are they so popular? And I started doing more research on the decision psychology behind those things and the empirical research on what actually measurably outperforms or underperforms, even our baseline intuition. And that's where a lot of this kind of came from.
Oh, well, welcome to the show. And I know it came out a while ago, but congratulations on the book. There's a lot of great information in here. And I happen to be one of those people who was taught some of those old ways and using it and reading your book. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So, congratulations on that and welcome to the show.
Oh, sure. Well, in fact, we kept writing books, by the way. I wrote 2 more after those 2. And the last one, the 4th one, I just finished the 2nd edition of, and that's How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. So it's really an extrapolation of that book, the one you're holding up the 2nd edition of, to cybersecurity. So I thought I'd mention that.
Oh, well, congratulations on all of those books. Now, early in the book, you have a great quote. A weak risk management approach is effectively the biggest risk in the organization. What did you mean by that?
Well, when I look at the actual methods that people are using and the research behind whether or not they improve decisions or work in any way at all, it's pretty disconcerting. It appears that the most common risk assessment methods So the risk management has to be based on some risk assessment at some point. So they're assessing risk. I'm not saying that risk assessment is synonymous with risk management. Clearly, part of risk management is assessing the risk, so you know what to manage, you know what to prioritize, and so forth. Well, some of the methods that are so popular seem to actually add error to decision making. So there's been a lot of research on this. So it's been going on for decades now. And I felt like a lot of the research that was pointing out how bad some of the methods was still obscure, that people didn't know about the research. So I just started digging this research up, citing it in presentations and workshops I made. I decided to put together a book, and that's what that became. But think about it. If the risk assessment method itself is broken or even adds error, that affects everything else you do in risk management. Somebody might say, well, people are my biggest risk, whatever that means. They might say cybersecurity is my biggest risk, or some other category of risk is my biggest risk. But all of those are informed by the risk assessment method, ultimately. So that's the apex risk, the meta risk. It's the risk of the risk assessment method itself. When we adopt any methodology at all, decision-making methods, et cetera, we're basically assuming that I'm going to make better decisions and estimates with that method than I would have without it. My unaided intuition is kind of a baseline, and I have to beat that model, the unaided intuition model. I have to beat that to justify any effort I put into additional analysis. What you don't want to do is adopt methods that actually add error to my unaided intuition. You've heard of garbage in, garbage out kind of problems, right? What you don't want is, and that's true for any model, no matter what it is. Certainly our intuition has that problem. But what you don't want to use is a method that adds more garbage of its own, right? Garbage squared, right? So you don't need that. There are some methods that measurably outperform subjective estimates alone. And so we should use those. In fact, not all subjective estimation methods are equal. Some subjective estimation methods measurably outperform others. So even subjective methods using subject matter experts by itself isn't necessarily an uninformative or bad thing. We use that quite a lot. You just have to use it a certain way.
Well, in business continuity, we use a risk assessment, and we basically have the probability times impact equals your risk.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the kind of thing that we're doing wrong?
Well, in principle, that's not bad if probability and impact are actual quantities. And I don't mean pseudo quantities like a scale of 1 to 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
Probability is a well-defined mathematical term. And do you mean, for example, if we say that something's unlikely, do you mean there's less than a 10% chance per year that this event would occur? Is that what we mean? So what is the chance of that event? Don't just say less than 10%. Is it 1% or is it 5%? And by the way, there are ways to benchmark some of those things. So you don't have to feel like, well, I don't use quantitative methods because I lack data. The lack of data is not alleviated by qualitative scores. You still lack the data. You just feel better about it. That's the only difference. Just feeling better about lacking data. So saying that a probability is likely or unlikely or high, medium, low, instead of that, and there's been a lot of research on this, that adds error to our unaided intuition. What we should do instead is learn how to subjectively assess probabilities. It's a skill you can learn. We can actually measure somebody's skill at subjectively assessing probabilities through a series of exercises, and we can measurably improve it during about a half day of training. After a half day of training, about 85% of subject matter experts are statistically indistinguishable from a bookie at putting odds on things. So why not just do that? Why not just get measurably better at subjectively assessing probabilities and then use actual probabilities? Because once you speak that language, there's a lot of neat stuff we can do. Even if you keep it really simple, already you're avoiding some of the error that's added by those qualitative scales. Now, I can get into quite a lot of the research about the error that's added by those qualitative scales. Among other things, there's this illusion of agreement or illusion of communication, that when somebody says this is a 2 on a scale of 1 to 5, or that's a moderate, you and I might believe we've agreed. And when you debrief us in detail, you find out we meant completely different things. There's been a bunch of research on that. Even when people carefully define each of the bins, like perhaps your risk matrix that you've been using, maybe the likelihood scale, a 1 means less than this % chance per year. Often they leave out the time. You can't, by the way, you can't do that, but they'll just say less than 10% chance of occurring, whatever that means. 10% chance of occurring, what, once in a century or once in a month? I have no idea what it means. But whatever a 1 means, maybe you carefully define it. Maybe a 2 is everything between 10 and 25%, and a 3 is 25 to 60% or something like that. Does that sound familiar? And maybe the impact is defined the same way. 1 is less than 1 million, 2 is 1 million to 5 million, or something like that in terms of dollars. Well, there's this phenomenon called partition dependence. And this one researcher, Craig Fox, spent a lot of time looking into this. We might think that how we carefully define each of the bins is what's actually informing people's choices. That if I define 2 differently, people would use 2 differently because I've defined it differently. That's actually not a very good assumption. What appears to be an overriding factor in people's choices, not the only factor, but an overriding factor in people's choices is just how many points there are in the scale. If it's a 5-point scale, they distribute their answers a certain way, more independent of the definitions than you might want to think. All right. So you might have carefully defined each of the bins, but the fact is they're going to distribute their answers on a 5-point scale to their 5-point scale distribution habit, whatever that is, right? Likewise on a 7-point or 10-point scale. So we have all these weird behaviors when we're forced to make choices about continuous values on discrete scales. So there's a lot of research about that. And none of that research is taken into account when people define these risk matrices. One of the most extensive papers in this whole field was by a series of authors by Bickel, Thomas, and Bratvold, The Risk of Using Risk Matrices. It was a very comprehensive literature review of all of the existing literature to date and some original empirical research. And they concluded that risk matrices should not be used for decisions of any consequence. That was their ultimate conclusion. That was, I'm quoting that, should not be used for decisions of any consequence. Another researcher, Tony Cox, said they can be worse than useless. What he meant was they're not just a waste of time. He means they actually added error to your unaided intuition. So not only were they a waste of time, but they actually made your estimates worse. It wouldn't be so bad if they were just a waste of time, but at least your decisions weren't worse than they were before. That's what I would call merely useless, but the worse than useless are what Tony Cox is declaring most risk matrices to be. And there's really no way to fix it. A lot of people say, well, if you use risk matrices correctly or a correctly designed one, you don't need them at all. A simple quantitative method based on direct estimation, even subjective estimation of probabilities and impacts, ranges of impacts, just do that math. Forget the whole matrix and coming up with bins. You don't need it. Think about physics and engineering. People don't have to come up with bins for things like temperature and joules and electrical current. It's a continuous value. So and all of the math about risk analysis is based on these continuous values. We didn't have to make up something new because we think we lack data. Therefore, I don't have the data to put probabilities on things. Again, you're not alleviating any of those problems by coming up with ambiguous scales.
Two questions come to mind. The first is, do we let our own personal experiences into some of this risk determination, and using matrices? Because you and I will live in different places. We will have different experiences. So if we do a risk assessment on whatever it may be, do our personal perspectives influence some of these risk matrices, which is why they sometimes become
useful? That would be true for even quantitative methods that depend on subjective inputs. Of course, people will have different subjective assessments of uncertainties if they have different uncertainty. If one person has more information than the other, then of course it would be rational for one person to put a wider range on some impact than another person because another person has more information than the other. That's completely rational. The question we should ask is, under a state of uncertainty and subjective estimates, which methods using subjective estimates measurably outperform others. And there are methods that are, even though they're subjective, are still measurably better than alternatives. So that's what we should do. We should just skip the whole scales thing, just learn how to directly assess the quantities that any actuary or statistician or mathematician or operations research analyst would use, even if it's subjective.
That kind of answers my next question is, should we throw away the matrices then that we've all got? Because I know in coming from business continuity management, believe me, all the accounting houses, everybody I've ever run into, you have to have a risk assessment, and it's all based on the severity, impact, or probability, or whichever terms they want to use, matrix. And that's what you build your programs on from there.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And that's the problem, because it's every empirical study that's been done either showed it adds no value at all or makes things worse. There has not been a single reproducible empirical study that says that people are actually experiencing fewer risk or making better forecasts because they're using a risk matrix. Never happened. There's plenty of research to the contrary that says that it's making things worse. Furthermore, and this is even more important, there's lots of research about things that do work. We know that even relatively simple, naive statistical models, even those informed by subjective estimates of trained individuals, when I say trained, I mean calibrated. In other words, we've measured their ability to subjectively assess odds. Those are measurably better than our unaided intuition prior to that. So why are we even dealing with risk matrices at all? We already know about preferred alternatives. We know that the risk matrices, if anything, seem to add error. And we already know some alternatives that are better than our unaided intuition. So let's just do that. And by the way, none of this is pure theory that I'm talking about. It's all based on sound research. But everything I'm talking about are things that we've implemented in dozens of organizations. Enterprise risk management in many fields: oil and gas, cybersecurity, big IT project risk, mining risk, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, all of these different areas we've applied these methods. This is all practical stuff that people use right now. And I didn't invent these methods. These methods have been around for quite a long time, some of it's centuries. So we didn't have to invent things. The problem with the risk matrix, and you might have seen this in the book, is we did kind of a patient zero analysis. I kind of wondered where they came from. And I think we found some good candidates for patient zero. It actually came from a related thing called a criticality matrix in oil and gas. And so this oil and gas company had an auditor who wanted to express their risk. And auditors, when they talk about risk, auditors tend to focus on deterministic things. Okay, so when they talk about risk, they have these very soft, non-quantitative methods of discussing risk. It's all moderate risk is more than extreme, less than extreme risk, et cetera. They have these other terms for it. So they deviate completely from statisticians and actuaries and operations research, management science, decision analysis people. They went down a completely different route. Well, apparently, one of those auditors from an oil and gas company, we think it was Gulf Canada, presented a version of a criticality matrix that left out some of the details that they were using previously. And it just had, a score, a 1 to 5 scale, and then some nice colors. And here's where your risks are, because you had dots up here. And so people thought that was communicating something. Well, when that was presented, a few of the major consulting firms were attending the same conference, including people from Arthur Andersen Consulting and a lot of the other big ones. And they picked that up and they made their own versions and they all started marketing it. And some of it ended up going into law, like it's actually in Dodd-Frank. No one asked whether or not it improved performance or made anything better. It was just simpler and people felt they understood it. Well, this feeling that we understand something is actually itself an illusion, a well-understood illusion in psychology. Okay, just because we feel that we understand something doesn't necessarily mean that we're making better estimates or decisions about it. So there is a kind of analysis placebo I've noticed in several different areas of research. So they didn't use that term. I just noticed in different areas of research, they were kind of talking about the same thing. The general tendency to believe that if you adopt something that seems like a structured procedure in some way, that your estimates and decisions are necessarily going to be better because it's structured. Well, astrology is structured. That doesn't mean anything. So there's lots of things that are structured nonsense. Okay, that doesn't add anything to it. So I've called it the analysis placebo because what they measured in their research is that even when estimates were not improved or getting worse than they were before, confidence always went up after adopting a new method. Now, how is that even possible? How can my confidence improve when my measured performance is getting worse? Well, it's because we don't get immediate feedback on our measured performance in risk management. If you say that something is, say, 10% likely or unlikely or extremely unlikely, and the impact is this much, you have to watch your system for quite a long time to even observe an unlikely event to have some level of confirmation about the feedback on your decisions and so forth. Right. So because we have this very slow, inconsistent, and ambiguous feedback in risk management, it's very easy for us to fool ourselves that when we adopt a method that seems like it should work, we feel better about it. The only way we can really answer that question is not rely on our personal observations. Those will be insufficient. That's not sufficient data to test risk analysis for rare, impactful events. So my own immediate experience is not going to work for that. What I have to do is look at the research on the performance of individual components. And there's lots of research on it. We know the research on how well do simple statistical models compare to unaided intuition of experts in a variety of fields. How well do the qualitative models perform? How well do Monte Carlos perform, even when the inputs for the Monte Carlo are subjective? How well can people be trained to subjectively assess probabilities? How much does our decision depend on our willy-nilly risk tolerance that day? And is there a way to quantify that so it's not moving around all the time? Well, we know the answers to these things. We don't have to wing it. So I'm just simply telling people, here's what the research says. You're not going to learn about the performance of your risk assessment method by waiting around for things to happen or not in your environment. That's not immediate feedback.
Yeah, and I definitely know that's what happens in business continuity, disaster planning, cybersecurity. I've been in sessions where people sit around just throwing all that kind of information around, and then I swear half the time it feels like they're just throwing a dart against the wall. Okay, there's where we are. And that's right. What we do based on that.
And it's not like they know nothing. They know something. We're just eliciting the information and using it incorrectly. That's the problem with it. So we can still use their subject matter expert knowledge, but we have to, first off, train them how to express that knowledge probabilistically. It doesn't take a lot of training. It's relatively short training. It's a half a day. All right. It's relatively short training. We can measure how well they subjectively assess odds. We can measurably improve it during the training. And then they just speak that language thereafter. They don't need the high, medium, lows, red, yellow, greens, or any of that stuff anymore, or a 2 on a scale of 1 to 5. They say there's a 5% chance per year that this event would occur. And if it occurs, my 90% confidence interval for the monetary impact is $1 million to $5 million, or whatever it is. Now, and that can be added, you can add a lot more to that. You can make it much more elaborate, much more granular, but at least now we're speaking the language of probabilities. We're speaking in mathematical terms that we can add more to. Like, for example, if we went out into the world and gathered more data to conduct a measurement to reduce our uncertainty about those estimates, we know how to do the math with that. If we go out and gather some additional research, maybe somebody else did a big survey on the frequency of certain events, and we want to use that information to update our initial estimate, which still uses our prior probability, our prior state of uncertainty based on our knowledge specific to our individual organization, but now we have some new information from outside the organization. How do we do the math to update that? Well, that's not a new thing. That's Bayesian methods. Okay, we know how to do that. I don't know how to move dots on a risk matrix when you gather more information. It's not a mathematically defined process. We're winging it again. So it is one of the challenges I talked about in the book for risk management, is this wide adoption of methods that we know don't add value. And they're still very popular in many fields. And and not just business continuity, but cybersecurity, enterprise risk management, operations risk, a project risk, a large IT project, et cetera. And in some areas of finance, even it comes up, like in not in Dodd-Frank, for example.
I've been a part of all those sessions. So yes, that's true. And they all still use that same old matrices method. On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking today with Douglas Hubbard, the author of The Failure of Risk Management, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.